In the burning heat of 1942, deep in the Libyan desert, near the settlement of Jalia, a child was born into hardship. His name, Muammar Gaddafi, came from a Bedouin family, raised in a nomadic tent with no electricity, no running water, and barely enough food to survive. But even as a boy, those around him could sense he was different, ambitious, obsessed with power as he grew. He studied the politics of revolution and the stories of anti-colonial heroes. His sharp mind and natural charisma earned him a place in the military academy in Seba, where he trained under foreign advisors. Later, he was sent to England for specialized training, young soldier studying the tactics of empires he one day planned to defy. By 1969, he was only 27 years old, but ready, alongside a trusted circle of young officers, including Captain Idris Nkomo and Lieutenant Malika Mani. He launched a sudden coup against King Rashad Idris, the aging monarch of Libya. It was swift and bloodless. Within hours, the monarchy was overthrown, and Gaddafi had seized full control of the country. He didn't waste time. American and British military bases were shut down. Libya's oil fields were nationalized. Gaddafi declared a new vision for the nation, one he called the Jamahiriya, a state where the people ruled. But in truth, only he did. Every voice of dissent was silenced. Through the 1970s and 80s, Gaddafi's face became infamous. He wore flowing robes, dark sunglasses, and always carried a copy of his Green Book, a bizarre blend of socialism, Islam, and authoritarianism. He funded radical groups across Africa and the Middle East. Rebels, separatists, terrorists, anyone who opposed the West found a willing backer in Gaddafi. Then came the bombings. The Pan Am Flight 103 explosion over Lockerbie, Scotland, in 1988 killed 270 innocent lives. The world pointed its finger at Libya. Sanctions followed. Isolation began, but Gaddafi refused to back down. Even so, behind his steel walls, Libya's own people were suffering. Families in the countryside struggled to survive, while Gaddafi and his inner circle grew rich. Oil wealth never reached the streets. Political parties were banned. Journalists disappeared. Ordinary men like Nasir Dogo, a school teacher in the town of Hadria, were imprisoned for whispering the word freedom. Yet, Gaddafi still dreamed big. In the 2000s, under mounting pressure, he tried to change his image. He abandoned chemical weapons programs, welcomed Western diplomats, and opened Libya's markets. He spoke of unity across Africa and styled himself as King of Kings of Africa. That the people hadn't forgotten. Decades of brutality couldn't be wiped away with a handshake. In the shadows, anger simmered. The youth in towns like Gazra and Bintal grew restless. They had never known a Libya without Gaddafi, and they were tired of waiting for change. By the end of 2010, the air was heavy with tension. Across North Africa, regimes were crumbling. Tunisia, Egypt, and beyond, leaders were falling to the fury of the streets. And soon, Libya would be. Next, it started with a Nema lawyer named Farid Tarim, arrested in broad daylight for speaking the truth. He had dared to mention the 1996 massacre inside Darmalik prison, where over 1,000 inmates were executed under Gaddafi's orders. The regime thought his arrest would silence others. Instead, it lit a spark. On February 15, 2011, dozens gathered outside a police station in the coastal city of Baruna. They weren't shouting slogans. They were demanding the release of Farid Tarim, but within hours, the protests grew. The streets filled. Chants turned to roars. The anger that had simmered for decades now erupted. 2 days later, February 17th became known as the Day of Rage. The rebellion spread like wildfire across Baruna, Daha, Narak, and Donira. Protesters of all ages marched shoulder to shoulder, fueled by frustration, demanding change. They had no weapons, only voices. But Gaddafi's forces met them with bullets. Snipers were placed on rooftops. Armored trucks rolled through neighborhoods. Reports from overwhelmed hospitals confirmed what many feared: hundreds were gunned down in the streets, many shot in the head or chest. These were not warning shots. These were executions. State media called the protesters traitors. Gaddafi's inner circle appeared on television. son Kamal al-Gaddafi delivered a chilling warning. If this continues, the streets will run red with rivers of blood. The threat backfired. By late February, soldiers began to defect. A major unit led by General Suleiman Dastan refused to fire on civilians. Instead, they turned their guns on loyalist forces and helped protesters seize control of the city. Police stations were set ablaze. Weapons stockpiles were emptied. The revolution was no longer symbolic, it was armed, as government control slipped. In the east, cities like Narak, Marafa, and Zara witnessed open battles between rebels and state security. Fighter jets were scrambled to bomb protest strongholds. But some pilots chose exile over orders, flying to neutral countries and requesting asylum instead of dropping bombs on their own people. In the chaos, a group of defected leaders formed a new body, the National Transition Committee, NTC. On February 27th, it was announced in Baruna, led by Mustafa Jalani, a former justice minister who had turned against the regime. The committee vowed to build a free Libya, one without tyranny. But Gaddafi wasn't finished. He still controlled Darut al-Salam, the capital, and its western provinces. Loyal units like the elite K-17 Brigade, commanded by his son Kamis Gaddafi, were better equipped, battle-hardened, and fiercely loyal. Gaddafi's government also hired mercenaries from neighboring countries to suppress dissent, offering them weapons and immunity in return. By March 2011, the civil war was no longer local, it was global news. Gaddafi's forces intensified their assault, using tanks and airstrikes to retake cities in the east. Civilians were buried beneath rubble. Neighborhoods burned. Videos of charred buildings and bloodied children began circulating worldwide. The international community took notice. On March 12th, the Arab League called an emergency meeting and pushed for foreign intervention. 5 days later, on March 17th, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing the use of all necessary measures to protect civilians. A no-fly zone was enforced. Airstrikes were approved, and then it began. On March 19, Operation Steel Horizon launched. Cruise missiles rained down on radar sites, anti-aircraft batteries, and command centers. Warships from multiple nations fired in unison. Jets screamed across the Libyan sky, hitting targets near Ajmer Zinter. In the outskirts of Dar al-Salam, tanks approaching Baruna were torn apart mid-road. 4 days later, NATO took full command of operations under the name Unified Shield. Gaddafi's defenses began to crumble. Convoys were destroyed before they could move. Depots were bombed. Communication lines went silent. Still, Gaddafi appeared on state television, his voice defiant, his tone venomous. He called the rebels traitors and vowed to cleanse Libya street by street. But his words no longer inspired fear. The ground had shifted. Rebel fighters from all corners of the country began closing in. From the mountains to the deserts, from the east and the west, the battle lines were tightening. And in the shadows, Gaddafi began to prepare not for peace, but for survival. As spring turned to summer in 2011, the walls around Gaddafi's empire began to crumble. NATO jets patrolled the skies. Missiles fell day and night. Convoys were ambushed. Weapons depots were turned to fire and ash. The regime that once ruled with an iron grip was now running low on everything: fuel, food, fighters, and fear. Still, Gaddafi refused to surrender. He tightened his hold on Dar al-Salam, the capital. Loyalist troops dug in across the western districts. His son Kamis commanded the elite K-17 Brigade with tanks and artillery positioned at key checkpoints. Mercenaries from outside Libya were deployed to fortify the city's defenses. Anyone suspected of betrayal was imprisoned or executed, and yet, beyond the fortified walls, the resistance was growing stronger. From the east, fighters from Marafa advanced along the coastal highways. From the mountains, units from Zintir and Rabania launched coordinated attacks on supply routes. From the west, secret cells inside Dar al-Salam prepared for their moment. On August 20th, the plan went into motion. The operation was called Storm. On a final push to take the capital. Rebel leaders had spent weeks preparing. Fighters were smuggled into the city ahead of time. Ammunition was hidden in abandoned buildings. Roads were mapped. The signal was simple. Once the outer defenses were breached, the uprising from within would begin, and it did. Explosions rocked the night sky. Columns of fighters stormed the city from the southern gates. Inside, civilians took up arms. Streets once filled with fear now echoed with chants of rebellion. Tojara, Falia, and Market Quarter. Loyalist forces struggled to contain the uprising. Snipers were overwhelmed. Checkpoints fell one by one. Within 72 hours, the city was lost. On August 23rd, rebel fighters stormed Fort al-Asra, Gaddafi's infamous compound. For over 4 decades, it had been his seat of power, a maze of concrete, steel, bunkers, and secrets. But this time, the gates didn't hold. Rebels poured in, seizing documents, weapons, and remnants of luxury, gold-plated pistols, designer furniture, half-eaten meals, but Gaddafi was gone. Intelligence reports confirmed what many feared: he had vanished before the attack began. Disguised, protected by a dwindling band of loyalists, he had slipped out of the city sometime around August 20th. No one knew exactly where he was. Some said he fled underground. Others believed he escaped in convoy. His family scattered. On August 29th, Gaddafi's wife Safa, daughter Amira, sons Hassim and Mahdi crossed the border into Algeron, where they were granted refuge. Another son, Salim, made it to Najari, where he was detained by local authorities. The empire was disintegrating in real time, but Gaddafi refused to leave Libya. To him, exile meant defeat. So he chose to retreat to a place of deep personal significance, Sirte. His birthplace, his last stronghold. Sirte was more than a city. To Gaddafi, it was the symbol of his legacy. During his reign, he had poured money into it, building grand roads, stadiums, and government offices. He once proposed that Sirte become the capital of a United States of Africa. Now, it was where he intended to make his final stand. By early September, Gaddafi had arrived accompanied by a shrinking circle of commanders, including General Abu Rashid, his longtime defense chief, and 2 sons, Mutassim, who took charge of military strategy, and Kamal, still believed to be moving between safe houses nearby. They hid in abandoned houses, slept in underground shelters, moved only under cover of darkness, but time was against them. The National Transition Committee (NTC) had declared Sirte their final target. Rebel brigades from all corners of the country began to converge on the city. They weren't just chasing victory, they were chasing closure. They wanted Gaddafi captured, alive. But Gaddafi had other plans. He fortified the city's entrances. Loyalist fighters laid traps, landmines, booby-trapped homes, sniper nests. Civilians were used as cover. Hospitals were turned into command posts. Apartment buildings became battlegrounds. The siege had begun. For the next several weeks, Sirte was torn apart by artillery fire, airstrikes, and urban warfare. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Supplies dwindled. Power lines were destroyed. Communications were cut. Gaddafi, now isolated and desperate, refused to speak publicly. No more radio messages, no more defiance. Silence became his final strategy. If no one could confirm he was alive, perhaps no one would know where to strike. But NATO watched from above. Drones scanned every corner of Sirte. Heat signatures, radio signals, any trace of movement was monitored. Slowly, the circle tightened. Gaddafi was running out of places to hide and time to escape. He knew the city would fall. The only question left was, would he die fighting, or try to vanish one last time? By mid-September 2011, the city of Sirte was surrounded. Rebel forces from Marafah, Zintar and Rabania had moved in from the east and west. The National Transition Committee, now recognized internationally as Libya's interim authority, has made one goal clear: bring Gaddafi to justice and end the war. But Sirte would not fall easily. Inside the city, Gaddafi's loyalists had turned every street into a trap. Snipers were hidden in high-rises. Artillery was positioned behind hospitals. Civilians were used as shields. Roads were laced with explosives. Even playgrounds were turned into minefields. Leading the defense was Muammar Gaddafi's son and military commander. Though their numbers had thinned, the remaining fighters were fiercely loyal. Many belonged to Gaddafi's tribe, deeply tied to the city and its fate. Gaddafi himself moved constantly, never staying in one place more than a few hours. He slept in half-collapsed houses, shifted between underground bunkers, and gave orders through human couriers. Phones were off. Radios were silent. NATO surveillance circled overhead, hunting any trace of movement. Electricity had long vanished. Water pumps stopped working. Supplies came in only through back channels, smuggled food, stolen fuel, scattered medicine. Dr. Naeem Karim, one of the last physicians still in the city, performed surgery by flashlight using whatever tools were left. The fighters were exhausted. Wounds went untreated. Hunger was constant. Some wanted to surrender. Gaddafi refused. He believed he still had a chance. That belief was tested daily. NATO jets pounded Sirte with precision bombs. Buildings fell like dominoes. Convoys were targeted before they could move. Even temporary shelters were tracked and destroyed. Still, Gaddafi clung to the belief that he could escape, regroup, and one day return. But the ring was closing fast. By late September, rebel brigades had pushed deep into the city. Neighborhoods fell block by block. Resistance was fierce, but one-sided, the siege had become a slow, brutal strangulation. Deaths mounted on both sides. The air reeked of smoke, blood, and broken concrete. Inside, Gaddafi's condition had worsened. Eyewitnesses later said he had grown pale and gaunt. His hair was longer, unkempt. Once commanding, now cracked with fatigue. He suffered from high blood pressure and stress-induced tremors. His bodyguard, Colonel Faraj Dahan, reportedly begged him to flee. But where? The road to the desert. The city of Sabbun had been blocked. Escape routes south toward Najari were being watched. Any vehicle that left Sirte was either destroyed or turned back. Options were vanishing. Still, Gaddafi had one last plan. He would break out. On the night of October 19th, his remaining inner circle gathered in the shadows of a ruined compound on the city's edge. There were no speeches, no final addresses. It's just quiet nods and the sound of engines warming up under camouflage. More than 50 vehicles, pickup trucks, armored SUVs, fuel tankers assembled into a convoy. Some were mounted with heavy guns. Others carried crates of ammunition, emergency rations, and weapons. At the center, surrounded by guards, sat Gaddafi. Alongside him were Mutassim, General Abu Rashid, Mansour, Dahan's head of security, and a handful of loyal commanders and family members. Their goal? Sneak past rebel checkpoints under cover of darkness and head southwest toward Wadi Rahim, from there to Sabbun. And if lucky, across the border. The escape began just after 8 p.m. Headlights were off. Engines ran low. The convoy moved slowly, weaving between craters and abandoned vehicles. Drivers whispered on radios, but even those transmissions were brief. They hoped the night would protect them. They were wrong. NATO drones had been circling, certain for weeks, tracking every movement. That night, one of them, an American MQ-1 Reaper, spotted the heat trail. The images were relayed within seconds. Confirmation followed. Authorization was given. At 8:30 a.m. on October 20th. As the convoy neared the western outskirts of Sirte, the first missile struck. A Hellfire missile fired from high altitude slammed into the lead vehicle. The explosion shattered the silence. Chaos erupted. Fighters screamed orders. Trucks scattered. Just minutes later, French Mirage jets arrived, bombing the rear of the convoy. Dozens of vehicles were destroyed. The desert was lit with fire. Gaddafi's escape had failed. Amid smoke and flames, Gaddafi and a handful of survivors, Mutassim, Mansour Dahan, General Abu Rashid, escaped on foot. Bleeding, coughing, covered in dust, they crawled through debris and slipped into a massive drainage pipe hidden beneath the road. It was dark, narrow, and foul. But it was shelter there, crouched in silence. The former ruler of Libya waited. Outside, rebel fighters were closing in fast. Guided by radio intercepts, blood trails, and satellite imagery, They began combing the area. They knew someone important had been in the convoy. They didn't know how close they already were. Not yet. The sun had just started to rise over the rubble-strewn outskirts of Sirte, but the air was already thick with dust, smoke, and tension in a shattered concrete. Pipe beneath the road, Muammar Gaddafi sat hunched, barely breathing. Around him, a handful of loyalists waited in silence. His son Mutassim, chief of security, Mansur Dahan, and General Abu Rashid, among others. They were wounded, disoriented, covered in blood and grime. They had survived the airstrike, but only barely. Just hours earlier, their convoy had been torn apart by drone-launched missiles and French Air Force bombs. Dozens of fighters died on the spot, trucks exploded, ammunition ignited. The few who managed to escape had done so by crawling through fire and gunfire into the sewers of Sirte now. The rebels were closing in. Fighters from Marafa, who had tracked the convoy's escape path for days, were combing the area. They checked buildings, overturned wreckage, and followed trails of blood across the sand. Some were locals. Others had traveled hundreds of miles just for this moment. When they spotted the drainage pipe, they paused. There were footprints, drops of blood, torn fabric. Then someone threw in a grenade. The blast echoed through the tunnel, but still, Gaddafi lived. Moments later, flashlights swept through the darkness. Rebel fighters crept closer, rifles raised. And there he was. Muammar Gaddafi, once feared across continents, was crouched in filth. His pants were torn. His flak vest was soaked with blood. His face was swollen and bruised, hair matted with sweat and dirt. Shrapnel wounds covered his right side. He tried to speak, but no one listened. They pulled him out and dragged him into the sunlight. He stumbled and fell. Mutassim was captured just minutes later, also wounded, his shirt soaked in blood. General Abu Rashid was bleeding heavily from the chest. A few others who tried to run were gunned down immediately. The others surrendered. They knew it was over. News spread instantly. Within minutes, dozens of rebel fighters converged on the spot. Some were shouting, others recording video on their phones. Gaddafi was placed in the back of a pickup truck, exhausted, defeated, barely conscious. But this wasn't a quiet arrest. As the truck moved slowly down the narrow road, fighters climbed in, surrounding him. Some beat him with rifle butts. Others slapped him, tore at his clothes, yanked his hair. There were screams, chants, curses, age-born from decades of dictatorship, bombings, torture, and fear. The violence escalated. Footage from mobile phones grainy. Shaking later showed Gaddafi slumped to one side, blood pouring from his head and torso. He tried to sit up. Someone shoved him back down. Others continued to hit him. There was no order, no protection, no command to stop. By the time the truck reached a rebel checkpoint under NTC control, Gaddafi was no longer moving. A medic attempted to check for a pulse, but it was already too late. The man who ruled Libya for 42 years was dead. The exact moment of his death remains unclear. Medical reports later confirmed gunshot wounds to the head and abdomen, some say. He was shot in the chaos. Others believe someone deliberately fired the final shot. No trial, no court, no confession. Just blood and silence. Mutassim and General Abu Rashid also died later that same day, one from a neck wound, the other from internal injuries. The bodies were taken to Marafa, a city that had suffered greatly during the war. For 3 days, Gaddafi's corpse was kept inside a refrigerated market, guarded by rebel fighters. Hundreds came to see it, some in disbelief, some in celebration. Photos were taken, videos were shared. The moment was broadcast to the world. On October 23rd, the National Transition Committee officially declared the civil war over. Libya had bled for 8 months. Over 30,000 lives had been lost. The country was now in new hands, but far from peace. As for Gaddafi, there was one final decision to make. On the night of October 25th, under complete secrecy, his body was taken into the western desert. No ceremony, no announcement, just a quiet burial in an unmarked grave, far from the cities he once ruled. To this day, the location remains unknown. His death was violent but perhaps fitting. It reflected the way he had ruled, through fear, through force, through blood. And, when the dust finally settled, one era had ended but a new, uncertain chapter was only beginning.